The groan of the wheels was a constant, weary complaint against the earth. For weeks, it had been the only music Elara Vance had known, a grinding accompaniment to the rhythm of her own anxious heart. The stagecoach, a cramped and sun-baked box of leather and wood, swayed and jolted, tossing her against the faded upholstery with a violence that had long since ceased to be surprising. Outside, the Wyoming Territory unspooled in a panorama of brutal, breathtaking emptiness. It was a land that did not welcome. It simply was. An endless sweep of silver-green sagebrush stretched to every horizon, shimmering under a sun that bleached the very blue from the sky, leaving it a flat, bone-white expanse. In the far distance, mountains bruised the clean line where earth met heavens, their peaks hazy and indistinct, like the backs of colossal, sleeping giants who cared nothing for the small lives that scurried across their domain. The land was a character in the story of her new life, she thought, and its first lines were ones of profound indifference. It was a power so immense it made her own fears feel small and fragile, a speck of dust caught in a vast, uncaring wind. Elara pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, the dust on the pane clouding her view. She was a woman made of softer things, of shaded Boston streets and the salty tang of the Atlantic carried on a damp breeze. She remembered the scent of old paper and leather in her father's library, the weight of a hardbound book in her lap, the polished gleam of the pianoforte in the parlor. She remembered the murmur of polite society, the rustle of silk, the taste of tea from a porcelain cup. All of it was gone, incinerated in the fire of her father's ruin. His name, once a bastion of respectability, was now a whispered shame. The ruin was not just financial, it was a demolition of their world, leaving them with nothing but the rubble of what had been. Her fingers, hidden in the folds of her modest wool skirt, tightened around the worn edges of a letter. It was her anchor in this churning sea of uncertainty, her map to a future she had purchased with the last of her pride. Mr. Silas Croft. His script was a marvel of precision, each letter a black, confident stroke on the thick cream paper. He wrote of Redemption Creek not as a raw frontier outpost, but as a kingdom in the making, and he, its benevolent, industrious king. He wrote of a handsome house he was building, of the respect his name commanded. He wrote of his need for a wife of good breeding and gentle temperament, a woman to be the mistress of his home and a reflection of his own rising station. He wrote of stability, of security, of respectability. They were words that should have soothed her, but they felt like stones in her stomach. Security was a cage, she feared, even a gilded one. But what choice did she have? Poverty was its own kind of prison, a meaner, colder one with no hope of a window dressing of comfort. She was 23 years old, her prospects in the East non-existent. She was a Vance of Boston, and now she was a mail-order bride, a commodity purchased to complete a man's vision of himself. She had to make this work. She had to bury the girl who loved poetry and the sea and become Mrs. Silas Croft, a woman of substance in the Wyoming Territory. She took a deep breath, the air thin and dry, and steeled herself. The past was a ghost. The future, however intimidating, was all she had left. The stagecoach crested a final, low rise, and the driver called out, his voice a gravelly crackle, "Redemption Creek!" Elara leaned forward, peering through the dust. It was less a town and more a wound on the landscape, a collection of raw lumber buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the immense emptiness that surrounded them. A single main street, a river of pale, churned dust, ran through its center. False fronts on the buildings gave them an air of flimsy importance, like children playing dress-up in their father's clothes. The saloon, the general store, the livery stable, each was a testament to raw, unvarnished survival. This was a place of harsh realities, and she could see it etched on the faces of the people who stopped to watch the stagecoach's arrival. Women in faded calico dresses, their faces weathered and weary. Men with sun-squinted eyes and calloused hands, their gazes lingering with a frank, assessing curiosity. She was a strange new bird in this land of hawks and sparrows, and she felt their eyes on her like a physical touch. Her traveling dress, though simple and dark, was of a cut and quality that marked her as an outsider. The air she breathed as she stepped down from the coach was a thick cocktail of scents: the alkaline bite of the dust, the rich, animal smell of manure from the stables, and the acrid tang of coal smoke from a nearby blacksmith's forge. It was the smell of effort, of a life stripped down to its essential, laborious core. A man detached himself from the shadow of the general store's porch and walked toward her. Silas Croft. He was exactly as his letters had suggested, and yet entirely different. He was handsome, with a clean-shaven jaw, dark, neatly combed hair, and eyes the color of a winter sky. His suit was black, impeccably tailored, and free of the ubiquitous dust that coated everything and everyone else. He moved with an air of absolute authority, the townsfolk parting before him as if by instinct. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that seemed out of place in this rough setting. He removed his hat, revealing a high, intelligent forehead. "I am Silas Croft. Welcome to Redemption Creek." He offered a smile, but it did not quite reach his eyes. It was a smile of ownership, of satisfaction at the arrival of a long-awaited delivery. He took her gloved hand in his, and his grip was not gentle. It was firm, possessive, a silent declaration. Elara felt a small, cold prickle of unease crawl up her spine, but she forced her own smile, a fragile, polite thing. "Mr. Croft, it is a pleasure to finally meet you." "The pleasure is all mine," he said, but his eyes were already scanning her, from the bonnet on her head to the scuffed toes of her boots, an appraisal that made her feel like a horse he was considering for purchase. Satisfied, he tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and turned to the stagecoach driver. "My man will see to her luggage." He then began to escort her down the main street, his pace brisk and confident. It was not a welcome, it was a tour of his domain. "This," he said with a sweep of his hand, "is the beating heart of our little enterprise, the Croft General Store." He gestured to the largest building in town, its windows gleaming, its porch swept clean. "We supply everything the good people of this territory need, from flour and nails to the finest yard goods east of Cheyenne." He led her past the saloon, its bat-wing doors swinging open to release a blast of noise and the smell of stale whiskey. "I have a significant stake in that establishment as well. A man needs a place to slake his thirst, but a wise man owns the well." He spoke of the land he had acquired, the timber rights he held, the freight contracts he controlled. He spoke of it all with the same proprietary tone, the same cool pride. Elara listened, nodding at the appropriate moments, but the prickle of unease was growing into a steady, chilling dread. He was not sharing his life with her, he was showing her the scope of his power. He spoke of her as if she were the final, perfect piece to be added to his collection. "A wife of your refinement," he said, "will lend a certain civility to this place, to my home." She saw the way the dusty cowboys and grimy laborers averted their gazes as they passed. Their stares, moments before so bold and curious, now slid away from Silas Croft's presence. He dismissed them with an impatient wave of his hand, a king brushing aside his less savory subjects. He was the pinnacle of this small, harsh world, and he wanted her to know it. He wanted her to understand that she was now part of that pinnacle, separate from and superior to the mud and grit below. But looking at the hard, tired faces of the people, she felt a strange and unwelcome kinship with them. They were trapped by circumstance, and she was beginning to fear she was as well. The driver and one of Silas's clerks were wrestling with her trunks, setting them on the boardwalk in front of the livery stable. One of the heavier bags, containing the last of her father's books, slipped from the clerk's grasp. It tumbled off the boardwalk and landed with a sickening thud in the muddy street, the latch bursting open. A few precious volumes spilled out into the filth. "Clumsy fool," Silas hissed, his charming facade vanishing in a flash of irritation. He took a step forward, his mouth opening to unleash a torrent of fury on the hapless clerk. But before he could speak, a figure moved from the deep shadows of the stable. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that was almost startling, the fluid, economic movements of a predator or a man who spent his life in perfect concert with the wild. Ilara's eyes fixed on him. He was lean, dressed in worn leather and denim that seemed molded to his frame, all of it covered in a fine layer of pale dust. His face was angles and shadow under the brim of a battered hat, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and skin darkened by relentless sun. When he lifted his head, she saw his eyes. They were dark, intensely so, and set in a face that spoke of two worlds. He was not white, not entirely. There was a heritage there that the town clearly did not understand, and so had decided to despise. As he stepped into the light, a silence fell over the street. It was different from the deference shown to Silas. This was a hostile silence, thick with suspicion and contempt. The townsfolk who had been watching now stared with open animosity. The man, Cale, said nothing. He did not seem to notice the stares, or if he did, he gave no sign. His focus was entirely on the task at hand. He knelt in the muddy street, his movements unhurried. With a gentle, almost reverent touch, he gathered her books. He took a kerchief from his pocket and carefully, patiently, wiped the mud from their covers. They were just books, but he handled them as if they were living things, fragile and precious. He rose to his full height and turned to her, holding them out. For a fleeting moment, his gaze met hers. The hostility of the town was not in his eyes. There was no malice, no challenge. There was only a deep, guarded stillness, a profound and shocking loneliness that she recognized in an instant, for it was a mirror to the desolation in her own soul. She reached out to take the books. As her fingers closed over the leather bindings, they brushed against his. A jolt, sharp and unexpected, passed between them. It was not the spark of a drawing-room flirtation. It was a raw current of silent understanding, a flicker of light in a shared darkness. The world seemed to narrow to the space of that single, accidental touch. The moment was shattered by Silas's voice, as sharp and cold as breaking glass. "That's enough. Get back to your work." The disdain in his tone was a physical thing. He did not look at Cale as a man, but as an animal that had wandered out of its pen. He made a curt, dismissive gesture. "The horses need tending. Leave the lady's things alone." Cale's expression did not change. The stillness in his eyes remained, but Ilara saw a muscle tighten in his jaw, a flicker of some immense, restrained force. Without another glance, he turned and melted back into the shadows of the stable, leaving Ilara standing with the clean books in her hands, her fingers still tingling from his touch. The incident was over in less than a minute, but it was a stark and brutal lesson. She now understood the rigid, cruel order of Redemption Creek. Silas Croft sat at its peak, a monument of power and control, and the silent man with the gentle hands and haunted eyes occupied its very lowest rung, a pariah in the world that was to become her home. "Come, Ilara," Silas said, his public charm reasserting itself as he took her arm again, his grip now feeling less like possession and more like a manacle. "I have arranged for you to stay at Mrs. Gable's boarding house until the wedding. It is the only respectable establishment for a lady in this town." He led her away, leaving the clerk to struggle with the rest of her belongings. The boarding house was a plain but tidy two-story building run by a woman named Martha Gable, a widow with watchful eyes and a mouth set in a permanent line of pragmatic tolerance for the world's foolishness. Silas did not linger. In the doorway of the small room that was to be hers, he gave her his instructions. He spoke of propriety, of the need for her to conduct herself with decorum. He told her which hours were suitable for a walk, and that she should not take one unescorted. He informed her that he would call for her the next day to begin her fittings for a new wardrobe, one more appropriate for the future wife of Silas Croft. His words were thinly veiled as concern for her reputation, but she heard them for what they were, the first bars of her gilded cage being locked into place. He finally left, and she was alone. The room was small and clean, with a simple iron bedstead, a washstand, and a single window. Ilara walked to it and looked out. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the vast, dusky plains in shades of lavender and bruised purple. The town of Redemption Creek was a tiny, fragile island of light and noise in an ocean of silent, empty land. She felt the walls of her new life closing in, the ceiling pressing down. The promises in Silas's letter, once a beacon of hope, now felt like the fine print on a contract she could not escape. He was a cold, commanding man who saw her as an acquisition, a final piece of polish for his frontier empire. And in the middle of that suffocating realization, another memory surfaced, sharp and unsettlingly clear, the memory of a silent man's gentle touch on a muddy book, the flicker of shared loneliness in his dark, haunted eyes. She looked out at the endless, untamed landscape. An hour ago, it had seemed like a prison, an indifferent expanse that had swallowed her whole. Now, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like both a threat and a strange, terrifying promise of a freedom she had never known she craved. The days in Redemption Creek settled into a routine as rigid and unyielding as the hard-packed earth of the main street. Ilara's life became a carefully choreographed performance, with Silas Croft as its demanding director. He courted her in a manner that was public, proper, and entirely devoid of warmth. On Sunday mornings, he would parade her to the small, sun-bleached church, his hand firmly on her elbow, her presence beside him a testament to his rising fortunes. He was the perfect gentleman, bowing to the ladies, offering a firm handshake to the men, his smile a polished veneer for the town to admire. From his own general store, he procured for her a new wardrobe. Bolts of silk and fine wool were transformed by the town's seamstress into gowns of fashionable, yet severe, propriety. They were beautiful, but they were not her. Each dress, in its rich but somber color, felt like a costume for the role of Mrs. Silas Croft. He even selected the books she was permitted to read, replacing her treasured volumes of poetry and romantic literature with dry histories and books of moral instruction. A woman's mind should be an orderly garden, Ilara, he would say, not a tangled wilderness. In these public moments, he was flawless, but when they were alone, in the stiffly formal parlor of the boarding house or during their evening walks, the director's hand tightened. His control was 1,000 tiny cuts. Sit up straight, my dear. A lady's posture is her silent calling card. Your Boston accent is charming, of course, but certain pronunciations are a bit provincial. We must soften them. He began to subtly steer her away from the few friendly faces in town. A conversation with Martha Gable in the kitchen would be interrupted by his arrival. A cool smile on his face as he reminded Ilara of some task or appointment. He was isolating her, trimming away any potential alliances, ensuring that he was the sole arbiter of her new reality. Ilara felt herself being sanded down, her edges smoothed, her personality planed away until she was nothing more than a beautiful, polished object designed to reflect his own glory. A part of her. The pragmatic voice of survival that had gotten her onto the stagecoach in the first place, screamed that this was the price of security. This was the stability she had craved. She had a roof over her head, fine clothes on her back, and the protection of the most powerful man in town. She had fled ruin, and this was its opposite. But another part of her, a wilder, more vital part she had thought long buried, was beginning to suffocate. The air in her gilded cage was growing thin, and with every passing day, she found it harder to breathe. The flawless veneer of the public Silas Croft began to crack, and she saw flashes of the man who lived beneath. One afternoon in the general store, a young clerk, barely a boy, accidentally miscalculated a transaction by a few pennies. Silas's voice, which he always kept so measured and calm, dropped into a low, venomous snarl. He did not shout. It was worse than shouting. He dressed the boy down with a series of quiet, surgically cruel insults, dismantling his confidence and competence until the young man stood pale and trembling, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. Ilara, who stood nearby pretending to examine a bolt of calico, felt a chill of genuine fear. Another day, A homesteader and his wife came into the store, their faces etched with the desperation of a failed crop and a long winter ahead. They were deep in Silas's debt, and they pleaded with him for an extension on their loan, their voices cracking with shame. Silas listened with a look of bored impatience before dismissing them with a flick of his wrist. "Business is business, Mr. Henderson," he said, his tone utterly devoid of pity. "The terms were clear. I will expect payment, or I will expect the deed to your land." He turned his back on them as the wife began to sob quietly, a broken, helpless sound that echoed in the store's sudden silence. Alara looked at Silas, at his handsome, untroubled face, and felt as if she were looking at a stranger. The town did not respect him, she realized with a sickening lurch. They depended on him, and they feared him, and he had built his kingdom on that fear. And by agreeing to marry him, she was placing the cornerstone on her own prison and becoming the queen of his quiet tyranny. Her encounters with Cale were the only moments that broke the suffocating monotony. They were fleeting, silent, and charged with a current of unspoken meaning that felt more real than any of the stilted conversations she endured with Silas. Silas had insisted she learn to ride a horse, but not the sturdy, sensible cow ponies the country demanded. He procured a delicate, high-strung mare, a proper lady's horse, as he called it. His lessons in the dusty corral behind the livery were exercises in frustration. He was an impatient teacher, barking commands, his corrections sharp and critical. "Keep your heels down, Alara. You are holding the reins as if they were a garden snake." During one of these miserable lessons, as Alara struggled to adjust a stirrup that Silas had improperly shortened, Cale emerged from the stable. He moved with his usual silent grace, carrying a bucket of water to the trough. He did not look at them, but he saw everything. Silas was distracted, shouting at a stable hand about a loose shoe on one of his geldings. Cale paused by her horse. He did not speak. He simply knelt, and with a few deft, efficient movements, adjusted the leather strap of her stirrup to the correct length. His touch was impersonal, his fingers brushing only the leather and metal, but she felt the warmth of his presence, the quiet competence that radiated from him. It was a stark contrast to Silas's loud, clumsy instruction. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, and was gone before Silas turned back. He never spoke to her, but their eyes would meet. Sometimes it would be across the dusty street as she sat on the boarding house porch, and he led a string of horses from the corral. Their gazes would lock for just a moment, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them. Other times, she would be walking with Silas, and she would see Cale at the blacksmith's, his back and shoulders straining as he held a nervous horse steady. He would glance up, and in that brief, shared look, she felt a sense of camaraderie, a lifeline. These silent exchanges became her only secret, the only part of her life that Silas did not own or control. Cale, with his guarded stillness and profound loneliness, made her feel less alone in the world. The pressure continued to build inside her, a desperate, aching need for solitude, for a single moment where she was not being watched, corrected, or molded. One hot, dry afternoon, on the pretext of needing a walk to clear her head, she slipped away. She walked past the last buildings of Redemption Creek, her feet finding an old cattle path that led down to a small, meandering creek. Cottonwood trees, their leaves rustling like dry paper in the breeze, offered a rare and welcome shade. She sat on a smooth, sun-warmed rock near the water's edge, the town hidden from view. Here, the only sounds were the gurgle of the creek and the buzz of insects in the tall grass. She was alone. She was herself. From a small satchel, she drew her most precious, secret possession, a slim, worn volume of poetry by John Keats, a relic of her Boston life she had managed to keep hidden from Silas's literary purges. She opened the book, the familiar words a balm to her frayed spirit. She read of nightingales and Grecian urns, of beauty and truth, and for a few precious minutes, she was transported away from the dust and desperation of her new life. She was back in a world that valued softness, that saw wonder in the turn of a phrase. A sudden, powerful gust of wind, a common ambush on the plains, tore through the cottonwoods, It ripped at the pages of her book, and before she could react, one thin, brittle page was torn free. It fluttered in the air like a pale yellow butterfly before landing gently on the surface of the creek, where the current immediately began to carry it away. "No," she whispered, a cry of real distress. The book was a part of her soul, and she felt the loss of the page like a physical wound. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling down the muddy bank, reaching for the disappearing speck of paper. It was then that she heard the soft thud of a horse's hooves on the dirt path. She looked up, her heart seizing with the fear that it was Silas, that he had followed her. But the rider who swung down from the saddle was not her fiancé. It was Cale. He had seen her leave town, had watched her solitary walk. He dismounted without a word and, without the slightest hesitation, waded into the shallow, ankle-deep water, his worn boots sinking into the soft mud. He moved with a calm purpose, his eyes fixed on the drifting page. He caught it just before it snagged on a tangle of roots, his fingers plucking it from the water with an infinite gentleness. He handled the sodden, fragile paper as if it were a wounded bird's wing, cupping it carefully in his palm as he waded back to the bank. He stood before her and held it out. "I believe this is yours," he said. It was the first time she had heard him speak. His voice was low and a little rough, as if it were an instrument seldom used. The sound of it seemed to vibrate in the quiet air between them. She took the page, her fingers trembling. "Thank you," she murmured, her own voice barely a whisper. It's a foolish thing to be so upset about." He shook his head, his dark eyes fixed on the book still clutched in her other hand. "What is it?" he asked. "Poetry," she said, surprised by the simple, direct question. "A man named Keats wrote it. He wrote about beauty, I suppose, and sorrow." He listened with that same unnerving stillness she had seen in him before, a focused intensity that made her feel as if she were the only person in the world. His gaze was thoughtful, not vacant. After a long moment, he spoke again, his voice softer now. "My mother told stories like that," he confided. The revelation was so unexpected, so intimate, that it stole Ilara's breath. She was Comanche. Her people passed down stories from one generation to the next, stories of the creation of the world, of great hunts, of beauty and sorrow. He did not elaborate, but he did not have to. In that brief, astonishing confession, he had given her a gift. He had forged a connection between them, a bridge built of shared reverence for a world beyond the grit and grime of Redemption Creek. He had seen the value in her book of poetry and had matched it with a piece of his own hidden soul. For a few minutes, they stood in a comfortable silence. The pretense of her life fell away. She was not Silas Croft's fiancée, a Boston lady fallen on hard times. And he was not the town's outcast, the silent man from the stables. They were just two people by a creek, sharing a moment of peace. He lifted his chin, his eyes scanning the vast, empty sky. "Look," he said. He pointed to a dark speck circling high above them on the thermal currents. "Red-tailed hawk." She followed his gaze. "It is beautiful." "He is hunting," Cale explained, his voice taking on a new, easy confidence as he spoke of the natural world. "He can see a mouse moving in the grass from that height. He will circle, patient, until the moment is right. This land teaches you patience, or it kills you." Ilara watched the hawk, mesmerized. For the first time, she was not just looking at the landscape, she was seeing it through his eyes, seeing the intricate, brutal, beautiful life that pulsed within it. The distant, clangorous sound of the church bell ringing the 6 o'clock hour echoed across the plains. The sound shattered the moment as effectively as a stone through glass. The spell was broken. She was Ilara Vance, soon to be Mrs. Silas Croft. She had been gone too long. There would be questions. There would be disapproval. The walls of her life rushed back in around her. "I must go," she said, her voice tight with a sudden panic. She gathered her book, the damp page held carefully within it. She turned to leave, to hurry back to the role she was expected to play. "Ilara," he said her name, just her name. It was not a question or a command. It was a simple, quiet utterance, spoken in his low, rough voice, but it landed with the weight of a vow. It was the first time anyone in this place had said her name and made it sound like her own. She did not look back. She could not. To look back would be to acknowledge the precipice on which she stood. She walked quickly, almost running, back toward the town, toward her cage. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm of pure terror and a strange, breathtaking exhilaration. That night, she lay awake in her small bed, staring into the darkness. The memory of the afternoon replayed in her mind, vivid and sharp, the feel of the sun on her skin, the sound of his voice, the shared intimacy of his confidence about his mother, the way he had said her name. Hanging on the back of her door was the newest dress Silas had bought for her, a gown of deep emerald silk for a dinner he was planning. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, it looked beautiful and impossibly expensive, but it no longer looked like a promise of security. It looked like a costume for a part she was no longer sure she wanted to play. She turned her head to look out the window at the vast, dark plains, now washed in silver by the moon. The landscape no longer seemed merely empty or threatening. It was Cale's world, a world of patience and hawks, of stories passed down through generations, of a dangerous, authentic freedom that called to something deep within her. The gilded cage had become an unbearable prison, and the man by the creek, the town pariah, had just shown her the key, though the thought of using it, of the ruin it would surely bring, terrified her to her very soul. The meeting by the creek had ignited a change in Alara, a slow, dangerous burn of defiance. The quiet, suffocating obedience she had mistaken for strength now felt like a shroud, a desperate need for freedom, an elemental pull as strong and mysterious as the moon's tug on the tides, drew her out of the town and into the vast, open plains. The delicate mare Silas had provided, once a symbol of her genteel confinement, now became her vessel of escape. Her rides became a daily ritual, a sacred pilgrimage. She would leave the town behind, its petty cruelties and watchful eyes shrinking in her wake, and push the horse into a gallop across the sea of sagebrush. Out here, there were no walls, no expectations. The only sound was the drumming of hooves on the dry earth and the rush of the wind past her ears, a wild symphony that seemed to unravel the tight knot of fear in her chest. She would ride until her hair came loose from its pins, whipping freely behind her. The air smelled of dust and wild herbs, a clean, honest scent that was the very perfume of liberty. The sky was an immense blue bowl arching over her, so vast and empty it made her feel both infinitesimally small and infinitely free. In these stolen hours of solitude, she felt a flicker of the girl she used to be, the Alara Vance who had existed before her father's shame and her own desperate bargain. She felt a kinship with the land's wild, uncompromising nature. It was a harsh, beautiful country that made no apologies for what it was, and it demanded the same of those who wished to survive it. It was in Cale's eyes, this landscape. It was in the quiet, patient way he moved, riding through his world. She felt closer to him than she ever did seeing his silent figure across the street in Redemption Creek. Silas did not approve. Her solitary excursions were, in his words, unladylike, improper, and dangerous. A lady of your standing does not go galloping across the prairie alone like a common farmhand, he told her one evening, his voice tight with displeasure. They sat in the boarding-house parlor, the air thick with unspoken tension. What will people think? It is a reflection on me. I find the air invigorating, she replied, her voice calm, her gaze steady. It was the first time she had not immediately deferred to his opinion. His eyes narrowed. I am thinking of your safety, Ilara. There are wolves out there, and other, less predictable dangers. I forbid you to ride out alone again. The word, forbid, hung in the air between them like a drawn blade. The Ilara of a week ago would have acquiesced, her spirit collapsing under the weight of his authority. But the Ilara who had shared a moment of profound understanding with a man by a creek simply held his gaze. You are my fiancé, Mr. Croft, not my jailer, she said quietly. "I will continue my rides." A dark flush crept up Silas's neck. The silence that followed was heavy and menacing. He did not raise his voice, but she could feel the violence of his anger simmering just beneath the surface. It was a promise of future retribution, a thinly veiled threat that chilled her more than any shout could have. Their relationship, already strained, now became a cold war, fought in the trenches of tense silences and loaded pleasantries. Martha Gable, the boarding house owner, saw it all. Her watchful eyes missed nothing. She noticed the darkening moods of Silas Croft and the new, brittle strength in his intended bride. She offered Alara small, unspoken kindnesses that felt like acts of solidarity. An extra blanket left on her bed on a cool night, a cup of hot, sweet tea waiting for her when she returned from a ride, a knowing, sympathetic glance that said, clear as words, "I see your struggle. Be careful." One afternoon, Alara rode out farther than ever before, chasing the distant, hazy line of the mountains. She was so lost in the rhythm of the horse, in the glorious, intoxicating feeling of escape, that she paid no mind to the world beyond her own exhilarating flight. The sun was hot on her back, the breeze a welcome caress. She was not the future Mrs. Silas Croft. She was not a ruined woman from Boston. She was just a soul in motion, a part of the wind and the sky. She did not notice the sky in the west changing, the brilliant blue slowly curdling to a bruised, sullen gray. She did not see the clouds gathering on the horizon, their bellies dark and heavy. A summer storm on the high plains did not arrive with polite warning. It attacked. The change came with terrifying speed. The temperature plummeted, the warm air vanishing as if a door to a winter cellar had been thrown open. The wind, moments before a playful breeze, became a howling, physical force that tore at her clothes and shrieked in her ears. The sky opened up, and rain began to fall not in drops, but in icy, wind-driven sheets that stung her skin and blinded her. Disoriented and panicked, Alara pulled hard on the reins, trying to turn the frightened mare back toward town, but the horse, spooked by the clap of thunder that seemed to split the sky directly overhead, reared violently. Alara, an inexperienced rider, was thrown from the saddle. She landed hard on the unforgiving ground, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. The mare, wild with terror, bolted and disappeared into the gray, churning chaos. Alara was left alone, soaked to the skin in an instant. Her thin riding dress offered no protection against the biting cold. Shivering uncontrollably, she struggled to her feet. In every direction, the world was a blur of driving rain and swirling dust. The landscape that had been her sanctuary, the symbol of her liberating spirit, had turned on her. It was now a deadly, indifferent enemy, and she was utterly at its mercy. Despair, cold and sharp as the rain, began to set in. She would die out here. She would freeze to death. A foolish girl who had dared to taste a freedom she could not handle. She sank to her knees in the mud, wrapping her arms around herself, a small, hopeless gesture against the storm's fury. It was then, through the torrent, that she saw it. A figure on horseback, a dark shape moving steadily through the maelstrom. For a delirious moment, she thought it was a spirit, a phantom of the plains come to claim her. But as the figure drew closer, her heart leaped with a pain that was equal parts terror and hope. It was Cale. He had seen her ride out, had seen the unmistakable signs of the coming storm in the sky that she had missed. Knowing her inexperience, knowing the danger, he had followed at a distance, a silent, unasked-for guardian. He swung down from his horse, his movements sure and economical even in the gale. He did not speak. There was no time for words, no need for them. His face, slick with rain, was a mask of intense focus. He reached down and pulled her to her feet. His touch was warm and strong through her wet clothes, a point of solid, living heat in the freezing chaos. He lifted her effortlessly onto the back of his horse, then mounted behind her, his body a shield against the worst of the wind and rain. He wrapped one arm around her waist, holding her securely against him, and turned his horse not back toward town, but away from it. He led them into a shallow canyon she had never known existed, the rock walls offering some small buffer from the howling wind. Tucked into the side of the canyon, shielded by a rocky overhang and a curtain of ancient junipers, was the dark mouth of a cave. It was his place, a private refuge hidden from the world. Inside, the roar of the storm was muffled to a distant, angry rumble. The small cave was surprisingly dry. He helped her down from the horse and, after securing the animal, immediately set to work. From a small, hidden cache of dry wood and tinder, he quickly built a fire. Within minutes, the small space was filled with a welcome, dancing light, the warmth a blessing that seemed to thaw the very marrow in her bones. Trapped together by the storm, with the firelight pushing back the shadows, the barriers between them finally crumbled. The silence that had defined their relationship gave way to something raw and honest. He took a piece of clean cloth from his saddlebag and gently began to tend to the scrapes on her hands and face from her fall. His movements were careful, his touch as light as a whisper. The simple human kindness of the gesture undid her. A great shuddering sob escaped her lips, the first of many. Shivering from cold and shock, she began to talk. The words poured out of her, a torrent of confession she was powerless to stop. She told him everything. She spoke of the grand house in Boston and the shame of its loss. She told him of her father's disgrace, of the whispers and averted gazes that had followed her everywhere. She confessed the crushing weight of her perceived debt to Silas, the way he had paid for her passage, for her very existence, and how he never let her forget it. "I feel like an actress in a play," she whispered, her voice hoarse, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "Every day I put on a costume and speak lines that someone else has written for me. I do not even know who I am anymore." Cale listened, his dark eyes never leaving her face. He did not interrupt, did not offer empty platitudes. He simply listened, his stillness a vessel that could hold all her pain. When she finally fell silent, exhausted and empty, he began to speak. He told her of growing up between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. He spoke of his Comanche mother, of the wisdom she had taught him, how to read the sky, how to listen to the earth, how to find water where there was none. He spoke of her quiet strength and the stories she told by the fire. Then he spoke of his white father, a good man and a failed dreamer, a trapper who had tried to build a life with a native woman and found himself shunned by both sides. He did not tell her the full tragedy of their end, but he shared the profound, aching loneliness of his isolation. He spoke of the pain of being judged only by his blood, of being seen as a savage by the whites and a half-breed by many of the natives. "I learned to be quiet," he said, his voice low. "I learned to live in the spaces between things. It is a lonely place to be." In his quiet confession, Elara heard the echo of her own sorrow. His was a wound of blood and birth, hers of fortune and circumstance, but they were the same in their essence, the pain of being an outsider, of carrying a grief the world could not see, a deep, soulful connection, forged in the heart of the storm, bound them together. The emotional intensity in the small cave grew until it was a palpable thing, a pressure that mirrored the fury of the storm outside. The firelight flickered across his face, illuminating the stark lines of his cheekbones, the deep, unguarded tenderness in his eyes. He looked at her, and in his gaze she saw not just desire, but a recognition, a seeing of her truest self, the self she had kept hidden from the world. It undid her completely. He leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. When his lips met hers, the kiss was not gentle or hesitant. It was a collision, a desperate, hungry release of all the pent-up loneliness, all the unspoken fear, all the impossible longing they had both suppressed for so long. It was a kiss of survival, a drowning man's gasp for air. In the warmth of the fire, shielded from the raging storm, their intimacy was an act of finding solace, of reclaiming a piece of their own humanity in each other's arms. It was a quiet, desperate rebellion against the cold, cruel world that had tried to break them both. In the quiet aftermath, They lay together by the dying embers of the fire. The storm had begun to recede, and a sliver of pale moonlight filtered into the mouth of the cave. His shadow fell across her skin, a dark, protective shape in the gloom. The warmth of his body was a comfort, but the reality of what they had done began to crash down on her with the force of a physical blow. She was Elara Vance, engaged to Silas Croft, the most powerful man in Redemption Creek, and she had just given herself, body and soul, to the one man he, and the entire town, despised and rejected. She had not just been imprudent, she had committed an act of social suicide. She had invited utter and complete ruin into her life. The terror of it was a cold fist clenching in her gut. In a moment of raw, overwhelming vulnerability, she turned to him, her voice a ragged whisper in the near silence. "You'll ruin me if you stay." He did not respond with words. He simply gathered her closer, his arm tightening around her, pulling her against the steady beat of his heart. It was a silent, aching acknowledgement of the impossible, dangerous truth of what had passed between them. He understood the stakes better than she did. Before the first hint of dawn could pale the eastern sky, as the last of the rain whispered on the rocks outside, he was gone. He slipped away as silently as he had come, leaving her alone with the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke on her skin and the crushing weight of an impossible choice. Elara walked back into Redemption Creek as the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the plains, erasing the stars. The world was washed in a clean, gray light, scrubbed new by the storm. She did not feel new. She felt ancient, as if she had lived an entire lifetime in the space of a single night. She was disheveled, her dress torn and stained with mud, her hair a wild tangle, but it was the change in her eyes that was most profound. The frightened, acquiescent woman who had fled town the day before was gone, replaced by someone who had looked into the heart of a storm and survived. She concocted her story on the long walk back, piecing it together from fragments of plausible desperation. She had been thrown from her horse, lost her bearings in the deluge, and found shelter in an abandoned line shack she had stumbled upon by pure chance. It was a flimsy, unconvincing tale, but it was all she had. Martha was the first to see her, her silhouette framed in the doorway of the boarding house kitchen. The older woman's sharp eyes took in Elara's state in a single, sweeping glance. She listened to the hurried, breathless story of the line shack without interruption, her expression unreadable. When Elara finished, Martha simply nodded. "You look half frozen, child," she said, her voice gruff with a kindness she rarely showed. "There is a hot bath waiting for you, and a fresh pot of coffee on the stove. Get yourself warm." There was a knowing look in her eyes, a deep, weary wisdom that saw through the flimsy lie to the complicated truth beneath. She asked no questions. The acceptance was a greater gift than Elara could have imagined. Silas was not so gracious. He arrived an hour later, his face a thunderous mask. He had spent the night organizing a search party, his fury at her disappearance warring with his concern for his damaged property. He found her in the parlor, clean and dressed, sipping a cup of Martha's coffee. His interrogation was not born of relief, but of cold, cutting suspicion. "A line shack?" he began, his voice dangerously soft. "How convenient. And where, precisely, was this shack?" Elara described a location she had imagined, a place vaguely north of town. "And you were there all night, alone?" His eyes bored into her, searching for any flicker of deceit, any shadow of a lie. "It is a miracle you were not set upon by wolves, or worse." "I was fortunate," she said, her voice even. The night in the canyon had forged something hard and unbending in her spirit. The terror of her situation remained, but the desperate need to placate him, to curry his favor, had been burned away. She could no longer pretend. She met his suspicious gaze without flinching, her own eyes clear and steady. She did not offer more details. She did not tremble. She simply sat there, a woman who had drawn a line in the sand of her own soul. He could not cross it. He saw the change in her, and it was this, more than her story, that stoked the fires of his paranoia. He left the boarding house that morning a deeply suspicious man, a man who sensed, with the unerring instinct of a tyrant, that he was losing control. Her demeanor toward him shifted from that day forward. The passive compliance was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable defiance. She no longer sought his approval for every small decision. She met his gaze directly during their tense, abbreviated meals, and she continued her rides. She no longer asked for his permission or even informed him of her departure. She would simply saddle the mare and ride out, her back straight, her destination a secret she held close to her heart. This new strength infuriated Silas. He saw it as a personal betrayal, a rebellion against his rightful authority. His possessiveness, always a cold and steady current beneath the surface, escalated into a churning, obsessive paranoia. He began to watch her. Sometimes, when she rode out, she would catch a glimpse of a rider on a distant ridge, a small, dark figure observing her from afar. Other times, in town, she would notice one of his clerks or a ranch hand from a property he owned lingering nearby, their gazes casual but their attention fixed entirely on her. His public facade of the charming, attentive fiancé began to crack under the strain. His smiles became brittle, his temper short. The town began to whisper, noticing the chill that had descended upon their most prominent couple. Silas Croft was a man accustomed to absolute control, and in Alara, he had found something he could not bend to his will. The obsessive tyrant beneath the tailored suit was beginning to show his face. The hidden canyon became their sanctuary. Ilara and Cale began to meet in secret, their stolen hours a universe away from the oppressive scrutiny of Redemption Creek. To get there, she would ride in one direction for a time, knowing she was being watched, before doubling back through a series of dry creek beds and low hills that would hide her path. Cale taught her how to do it, how to use the land as an ally, how to erase her tracks and move like a ghost. In the quiet solitude of the canyon, their love deepened, growing beyond the desperate passion of their first night into a true and steady partnership. With Cale, Ilara experienced a world of quiet beauty and profound knowledge. He was not just a part of the landscape, he was its student and its interpreter. He taught her how to read the story written on the earth. He showed her how the bent grass told of a passing deer, how the scrape marks on a tree trunk revealed a bear's territory. He taught her which plants could be eaten, which roots held water, which leaves could be crushed to soothe an insect bite. His knowledge was vast and practical, rooted in generations of survival. One afternoon, he took her to the far end of the canyon, to a sheer rock face protected by an overhang. There, etched into the dark red stone, were figures and symbols, ancient and mysterious. "Petroglyphs," he whispered, his voice full of reverence as he traced a swirling spiral with his finger. "My mother's people left these. They are stories, prayers, a map of the stars." He showed her the figure of a hunter with a bow, a herd of stylized bison, the jagged representation of a lightning strike, standing there, with the weight of that silent, ancient history all around them. Ilara felt the roots of their own stories sinking deeper, connecting to something timeless. Their love was not just a fleeting, illicit affair. It was a joining of two outsiders, two survivors, finding a home in a world that had offered them none. Their moments together were woven from a fabric of simple, profound intimacy. She would trace the lines on his palm, the calloused landscape of a life of hard work and sorrow, and wonder at the gentleness of his touch. In the evenings, they would build a small, smokeless fire, and she would listen to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heartbeat as she rested her head against his chest. They would share simple meals, a roasted rabbit he had snared, a handful of wild berries that tasted more satisfying than any of the fine, tense dinners she ate with Silas, under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. They talked, sharing the quiet truths of their lives, building a world that belonged only to them. It was during one of these evenings, with the first chill of autumn sharp in the air, that Cale finally entrusted her with the full, dark weight of his past. The fire crackled softly, a lone point of warmth in the vast, silent dark of the canyon. "I told you about my father," he began, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "I told you he was a good man. He homesteaded a piece of land a few territories over from here. Good land, with a river running through it. Too good. It turned out—" He paused, gathering the strength to unbury a memory he had kept locked away for years. There were powerful men in the nearest town, men who wanted that land for themselves. They said it was on its way to being a big cattle territory. They tried to buy him out, but my father wouldn't sell. It was his home, our home. His voice grew tight with a pain that was still raw. "So they sent men to drive us off. Prospectors, they called themselves, but they were just hired guns. They came one morning, just after sunrise. They shot my father's dog first. Then they told him to get his family and get off the land by noon, or they would burn the cabin down around us." Ilara reached out and took his hand, her heart aching for the boy he had been. "My father, he was not a fighter, but he was proud. He stood his ground. He told them to leave his land. One of the men just laughed, and then he raised his rifle and shot my father in the chest. He fell without a sound." Cale's voice broke, but he pushed on, the words coming out in a torrent now. "My mother screamed. I was just a boy, maybe 14. I did not know what to do. All I knew was that they had killed him. I grabbed my father's skinning knife from the table. One of the men came into the cabin, and I fought him. I was terrified. He was a big man, and he was laughing at me. In the struggle, the knife, I killed him." He stared into the fire, but Ilara knew he was seeing something else entirely. "My mother ran in from the other room to help me. The other man outside. He fired his gun into the cabin, just a wild shot in the chaos. The bullet, it struck her. She fell right at my feet." He fell silent, the horror of the memory sucking the air from the canyon. Ilara could picture it all, a terrified boy, his parents dead at his feet, a dead man beside him, the smell of gunpowder and blood filling the small cabin. "The last man, the one who fired the shot, he got scared then. He saw what had happened, and he fled. When the law arrived later that day, all they found was me, a half-blood boy, with my parents dead, and a dead white man with my father's knife in him. They did not care what I said. They did not look for the other man. They saw what they wanted to see, a savage who had murdered his own family and a prospector in a fit of rage." His confession was a moment of supreme, terrifying vulnerability. He had carried this impossible burden, this monstrous injustice, alone for years. Ilara looked at him, at the immense pain etched on his face, and her love for him, which had been a thing of solace and passion, was transformed. It solidified into a fierce, protective force, an anger so pure it felt like a holy fire in her veins. She was no longer just a woman in love. She was a woman who had been shown a profound, gaping wound in the heart of the world, and she felt a desperate, driving need to see it made right. The knowledge of his innocence, of the suffering he had so stoically endured, became the fuel for her own quiet rebellion. They knew they were living on borrowed time. The seasons began to turn. The vibrant green of the cottonwoods in their canyon gave way to a brilliant, fleeting gold. The beauty of it was almost painful, a perfect reflection of the perilous, precious nature of their affair. The golden leaves shimmered in the autumn sun, beautiful and doomed, and Ilara knew that, like them, their time together was destined to fall. They talked of running away, of heading west into the mountains, of finding a place so remote that their pasts could not follow them. They would whisper their plans in the dark, their hope a fragile flame against the gathering wind of Silas's paranoia and the coming winter. But the practicalities were a cage around their dreams. Ilara was bound by the debt, both real and imagined, that she owed to Silas. He owned her passage, her clothes, her very presence in this town, and Cale was a ghost, a man with no legal name, no legal standing. The rumor of his violent past was his shadow. To draw the attention of the law in any way would be to risk having his old warrant discovered, to risk the hangman's noose he had escaped once before. Their hope was beautiful, but as fragile as a single golden leaf clinging to a branch against the coming storm. The golden days of autumn, so vibrant and precious, could not last. They were a beautiful, borrowed time, and the debt was about to be called in. The inevitable happened on a crisp, clear afternoon when the sky was a deep and cloudless blue. Ilara and Cale were at the edge of their canyon, hidden from the main trail but visible from a high, distant ridge to the south. Cale was teaching her how to identify the tracks of a mountain lion. His head bent close to hers as he pointed out the details in the dust. The moment was one of quiet instruction, of intimate partnership. To a distant observer, it could have been mistaken for something else. The observer was a ranch hand named Jeb, a man whose loyalty to Silas Croft was absolute, born of fear and the promise of steady pay. He had been one of the men tasked with watching her, and his patience had finally paid off. He saw them, a man and a woman, their figures small but their closeness unmistakable. He saw Cale's dark head near Ilara's fair one. He saw enough. He spurred his horse back toward town, his mind alight with the importance of the news he carried. He delivered his report to Silas in the back room of the general store. He spoke in low, conspiratorial tones, his eyes gleaming with the self-importance of a favored servant. Silas listened without a single change in his expression. His face was a placid mask of control, but behind his eyes, a storm was gathering. The vague, gnawing creature of suspicion that had been feasting on him for weeks finally grew into a monster of white-hot, vengeful certainty. He had been made a fool of. His property, his intended wife, had been soiled by the one man in town he considered less than human. He dismissed Jeb with a curt nod and a silver dollar that felt more like a seal on a contract than a reward. Left alone in the quiet, dim room, Silas did not rage. He did not smash his fist on the desk. His vengeance was a colder, more patient thing. A direct, public confrontation would be messy. It would tarnish his own reputation, sullying his name with the indignity of having been cuckolded by a half-breed stable hand. The town would talk. Ilara's value as a symbol of his status would be ruined. No, he would not punish her directly. He would punish her by utterly destroying the man she had chosen over him. He would use the town's own ignorant prejudice as his weapon, and he would orchestrate it all so that his own hands appeared perfectly clean. His mind, so adept at the cold calculus of business and control, began to formulate a plan. It was insidious, elegant in its cruelty. He would not accuse Cale of a crime against him, but a crime against the community, a sin that the frontier punished with swift and unforgiving brutality: cattle rustling. It was a crime that struck at the heart of their livelihood, a violation universally condemned. The punishment was simple and certain: a rope and a tall tree. That evening, Silas sent for two of his most loyal and least scrupulous employees. Under the cover of a moonless night, they rode to the far edge of a neighboring ranch, one owned by a man who had recently had a loud, public disagreement with Silas over a water rights issue. They cut 3 head of cattle from the herd and drove them, quiet and fast, across the plains. Their destination was a small, unused parcel of land, a scrubby pasture of little value that bordered the livery stables. It was a place where everyone knew Cale sometimes let his own horse graze to supplement the livery's poor feed. The cattle, confused and restless, were left in the makeshift corral. The final damning piece of the puzzle was placed just as the sky began to lighten in the east. One of Silas's men dropped a branding iron into the dirt near the fence post. It was not a common brand. It was a distinctive design, a C with a looping flourish, the one known to belong to Cale's former employer at the livery, a man who had fired him weeks ago on Silas's subtle recommendation. It was a piece of circumstantial evidence so perfect it felt like fate. The discovery was made just after sunrise by the very rancher whose cattle had been stolen. Silas had sent him a pre-dawn, anonymous note about suspicious activity near the livery. The man's bellow of outrage was the spark that lit the fire. Within an hour, the main street of Redemption Creek was buzzing. Men gathered in angry knots, their voices low and dangerous. Silas Croft emerged from his store, his face a perfect mask of grave concern and righteous indignation. He strode to the center of the crowd, his voice ringing with authority. "We have tolerated a menace in our midst for too long," he declared, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the assembled townsfolk. "We have been patient, we have been charitable, but there is a rot among us, a thieving poison that strikes at the very heart of our way of life." He did not need to say Cale's name. Everyone knew who he meant. The town's simmering prejudice, the years of suspicion and contempt, boiled over. Silas fanned the flames, painting Cale as a dangerous animal who had finally shed his skin and shown his true colors. He called for justice, a swift and final justice that would cleanse their community. Sheriff Brody arrived, a harried look on his face. He was a man more concerned with keeping the peace than with finding the truth, a pragmatist who understood that the easiest path was often the one that aligned with the town's most powerful citizen. He listened to the rancher's furious accusations and Silas's damning pronouncements. He looked at the faces of the men, their expressions hardening into a mob mentality. He knew what was expected of him. He deputized a posse of the angriest men and rode the short distance to the livery stable. They found Cale brushing down a horse, his movements calm and methodical, completely unaware of the storm that was about to break over his head. He looked up, bewildered. As the sheriff and the grim-faced posse surrounded him, he offered no resistance as Sheriff Brody declared him under arrest for cattle rustling. He did not seem to understand what was happening until they put him in chains. The evidence, though flimsy and circumstantial, was more than enough for the citizens of Redemption Creek. In their eyes, he had been tried and convicted the moment he was born. This was the dark, tragic climax of their story, and Alara watched it all unfold from the window of her room in the boarding house. She saw the angry crowd gather. She heard Silas's voice, though she could not make out the words. And then she saw them lead Cale down the main street. He was in chains, his hands bound before him, his head held high. He did not look afraid, only confused and profoundly weary, as if he had been expecting this moment his entire life. The crowd jeered, their faces twisted with hatred. Men spat on the ground as he passed. Someone threw a rotten vegetable that struck him in the shoulder. He did not flinch. He just kept walking, a solitary, dignified figure in a sea of raw, ugly hate. Ilara's heart did not just break, it shattered. A wave of nausea and horror so profound washed over her that she had to grip the windowsill to keep from fainting. She knew, with a certainty that was as cold and absolute as death, she knew that this was Silas's work. This was his answer to her defiance. This was his revenge. That night, she waited until the town had settled into a tense, expectant quiet. Then she walked, a ghost in the darkness, to the general store. A light still burned in Silas's back office study. She did not knock. She opened the door and stepped inside. He was sitting behind his large oak desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand, a look of calm, triumphant satisfaction on his face. The charming facade was gone. There was no pretense left between them. In his eyes, she saw only a cold, cruel light. "He is going to hang," she said, her voice a dead, flat whisper. Silas took a slow sip of his whiskey. "Justice must be served, my dear. The man is a common thief." "He is innocent," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "And you know it. This is your doing." He smiled then, a thin, chilling smile that did not touch his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, the picture of a man in total control. He is guilty of stealing what is mine. The cattle are merely a pretext, a more public and more permanent resolution to the problem. He admitted it without a flicker of shame, his cruelty laid bare and gleaming in the lamplight. He set his glass down and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a tone of chilling precision. He laid out his terms, each word a carefully placed stone in the wall of her new prison. He will hang in 3 days, when the circuit judge arrives. There is, however, one way to prevent that unfortunate outcome. You and I will be married, immediately. Tomorrow morning, you will become my wife, in every sense of the word. You will be perfectly obedient, perfectly respectful, a model of propriety, and you will never, ever see or speak of that savage again. You will erase him from your mind. If you agree to these terms, I will find a way to persuade the rancher that he made a mistake. The evidence will disappear. Cale will be released, banished from this territory, but alive. Ilara stared at him, at the monster sitting so calmly behind the desk. The choice he was offering her was no choice at all. Cale's life. For her own.
"No,"
she whispered, the word torn from her throat.
"I will not."
For the first time, his composure cracked. A flash of pure, unadulterated rage crossed his face. He was on his feet in an instant, moving around the desk with a speed that was terrifying. He grabbed her by the upper arms, his grip like iron bands, bruising her flesh. "You will," he hissed, his face inches from hers. And for the first time, he was physically violent. He drew back his hand and struck her, a sharp, backhanded blow across her face. The sound of it was a flat, ugly crack in the quiet room. The pain was a starburst of light behind her eyes, shocking and absolute. She staggered back, her hand flying to her cheek, her mind reeling from the violation. "You foolish girl," he snarled, his voice a low, venomous rasp. "Do you have any idea of your position? I own you. I paid for your passage from Boston. I paid for the clothes on your back. You are my property, and you will do as I say. If you defy me, I will not only see him hang, I will see you utterly destroyed. I will throw you out into the street with nothing. You will be a destitute, ruined woman, and you will learn what it means to have nothing and to be nothing." He released her so abruptly that she stumbled and fell to the floor. He stood over her, his chest heaving, his face contorted with hate. He looked down at her, a crumpled, sobbing wreck on his office floor, with nothing but cold, triumphant contempt. Then he turned, walked back to his desk, picked up his whiskey, and drained the glass. He left her there, her body racked with sobs, the full, monstrous truth of his character finally and irrevocably laid bare. Desperate, her mind a maelstrom of terror and grief, she fled back to the boarding house. She found Martha in the kitchen, a lone lamp burning. The older woman took one look at the blossoming bruise on Ilara's cheek, and her expression hardened into a grim, knowing anger. Ilara did not have to explain. She just sobbed out a single, desperate plea. "I have to see him." Martha nodded once. "The night deputy is a drunkard and a fool. Give me an hour." An hour later, a small bundle of coins having changed hands, Ilara was led into the back of the sheriff's office. The town's jail was a single, flimsy cell with barred windows. Cale was sitting on the edge of a narrow cot, his back to the door. He turned as she entered, and his face, when he saw her, was a portrait of pure anguish. They spoke in hushed, urgent whispers through the cold iron bars. "Ilara, what happened to your face?" he asked, his voice thick with a pain that was entirely for her.
"It does not matter," she whispered, tears streaming down her bruised cheek. "Cale, I know you are innocent. This is Silas. He did this."
He reached through the bars, his fingers gently tracing the edge of her bruise, his touch as light as a feather. He did not need an explanation. He pieced it together instantly, his eyes dark with a terrible understanding. "He offered you a bargain, did not he?" he said, his voice a low rasp. "My life for yours." She could only nod, her throat tight with a fresh wave of sobs. "I do not know what to do." He gripped the bars, his knuckles white. The anguish in his eyes was not for his own fate, but for the impossible choice Silas had forced upon her. He begged her, his voice raw with emotion.
"Ilara, look at me. You cannot do it. Do you hear me? You cannot sacrifice yourself for me. That is how he wins. He will have you, and he will have broken me. Do not let him win."
He pressed his forehead against the bars, his next words a desperate, heartfelt plea. "Run. Get away from this place. Get away from him. Live free. For me. That will be my justice." His words, his absolute selflessness in the face of his own death, struck her with the force of a physical blow.
They ignited something deep inside her, a spark in the desolate, despairing darkness of her soul. Her sobs began to subside, her despair curdling into something else, something cold and hard and dangerous. Resolve. She looked at him, at his beautiful, tormented face, and saw not a victim to be saved, but a partner to be fought for. She left the jail that night not broken, but forged anew in the fires of tragedy. She would not be Silas Croft's victim. She would not be his perfectly obedient wife. And she would not let Cale die for a love he had so gently and fiercely protected. As she walked back into the sleeping town, the pain in her cheek a dull, throbbing reminder of the stakes, a glimmer of hope, born from the very depths of her despair, began to shine in the darkness. Ilara returned to the boarding house not as a victim, but as a soldier returning from a devastating defeat, her mind already working on the next phase of the war. Cale's words had been a flint, and her spirit was the steel. A spark of cold, hard resolve had been struck. She knew she could not overpower Silas physically. She could not win in a public argument where his word was law and his accuser was a disgraced woman. Her only weapon, the one thing he had consistently underestimated in her, was her intelligence. She found Martha in the kitchen, a solitary lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The older woman was waiting for her, a pot of coffee simmering on the stove. Ilara did not need to speak of the bruise or the terror. She only needed to lay out the beginnings of a desperate, impossible idea. "He keeps ledgers," Ilara said, her voice low and urgent. "In his office. He is meticulous. He documents everything." Martha listened, her expression grim. She had lived in Redemption Creek for 30 years. She had seen good, honest families broken on the wheel of Silas Croft's ambition. She had seen him acquire land and businesses through methods that were whispered about but never proven. She had seen too many good people crushed by men like him. "His arrogance will be his undoing," Martha said, her voice a low growl of long-held resentment. "He believes he is untouchable. A man like that writes down his sins as if they were accomplishments." A desperate plan began to form between them, spoken in whispers in the heart of the sleeping house. It was a wild gamble, a single shot in the dark against an unbeatable foe. Martha, a woman who had learned the rhythms of the town like the beat of her own heart, provided the key. "He meets with the circuit judge tomorrow afternoon," she said, pressing a small, cold piece of metal into Ilara's hand. It was a spare key to the general store's back office. "He will go to the hotel to ensure everything is in order for a swift trial and execution. He will be gone for at least an hour. That is the time you will have." Meanwhile, in the town's flimsy jail cell, Cale was not idle. Despair was a luxury he had never been able to afford. His life had been a long lesson in observation and patience. He had been studying his prison since the moment they had thrown him inside. The shoddy construction of the building, the way the wood swelled and shrank with the temperature, the predictable, lazy habits of the night deputy who would drink from a flask until his snores filled the small office. Most of all, he studied the single-barred window at the back of his cell. The iron was old, the mortar that held it in place was crumbling. Using his survival skills and an immense, focused patience, he had begun to work. He had pried a small, thin piece of metal from the frame of his cot, and for hours, shielded by the darkness, he had been meticulously, silently, picking away at the mortar around the base of one of the bars. It was slow, painstaking work, measured in grains of dust and silence. His chance came just after midnight. A drunken brawl, fueled by cheap whiskey and simmering resentments, spilled out of the saloon and into the main street. The night was filled with shouts, the crash of breaking glass, and the thud of fists meeting flesh. The night deputy, startled from his stupor, grabbed his pistol and rushed outside, eager to assert his meager authority. The distraction was all Cale needed. With a final, desperate effort, he put his weight against the loosened bar. It gave with a low groan, the sound swallowed by the chaos outside. He slipped through the narrow opening, a ghost in the night, and melted into the deep shadows of the alleyway. His first instinct, The primal urge for self-preservation screamed at him to run, to disappear into the vast wilderness that had always been his only true home, but a stronger, deeper instinct held him back. Ilara. He knew Silas. He knew the man's obsessive, cruel nature. With his prisoner escaped, Silas's full, unchecked vengeance would turn on her. He was not free until she was... He began to move through the back ways of the town, a shadow heading for the general store. The climax unfolded in Silas's dimly lit office. The air was stale with the smell of cigar smoke and self-satisfaction. Ilara, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break, slipped the key Martha had given her into the lock. It turned with a soft, metallic click. Inside, she moved with frantic purpose. The large oak desk was locked, just as she had expected. Using a heavy letter opener from the desktop, she worked on the drawer, her hands shaking, the wood splintering under the force of her desperation. The drawer gave way with a sharp crack. Inside, just as she had remembered, was a set of 4 thick, leather-bound ledgers. She pulled the first one out, her trembling fingers fumbling with the pages. She lit the desk lamp, the sudden pool of light feeling both like a beacon and a betrayal. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the columns of neat, precise script. It was all there. Documented in Silas's own arrogant hand was a decade of corruption, predatory loans to homesteaders at impossible rates, followed by foreclosure and acquisition of their land for pennies on the dollar, secret partnerships designed to bankrupt his competitors, inflated freight charges. Every ugly secret of his empire was recorded with the meticulous care of a proud collector. She found what she was looking for, a page detailing the loan to the Henderson family, the one she had seen him so cruelly dismiss. The entry was annotated in the margins, with a cold, clear note about the value of their water rights, and the date he planned to seize their deed. It was the proof she needed, the weapon she had gambled everything to find. Just as her finger traced that damning line of script, she heard footsteps in the main part of the store. Heavy, confident footsteps. Silas. He had returned unexpectedly. The office door was pushed open, and he stood there, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly curdled into pure, murderous fury. He had seen the light under the door. He trapped her, a predator cornering its prey. "You," he breathed, the word a venomous whisper. He advanced on her, his eyes glittering with a terrifying light. "I should have known you were too foolish to accept your place. I was going to be lenient. Now, I will have to teach you a final, brutal lesson in obedience." He lunged for her, his hands reaching for her throat. At that exact moment, the office door, already weakened from its frame, did not open. It exploded inward. Cale stood there, his figure silhouetted against the dark street, a coiled spring of pure, focused intensity. The final confrontation was not a stylized Western shootout. It was a swift, brutal, close-quarters fight, a desperate, grunting struggle of flesh and bone. Cale met Silas's charge, the two men crashing together with savage force. It was the raw, primal violence of two alpha animals fighting over territory. They slammed against the wall, then staggered into the desk, sending the lamp crashing to the floor. The precious, incriminating ledgers were scattered across the floorboards in a chaotic mess of paper and leather. The sound of the struggle, of splintering wood and guttural shouts, brought the law. Sheriff Brody, alerted to the jailbreak and heading towards the store, arrived with his deputy, their guns drawn. He burst in to find a scene of utter chaos. The office was a wreck, lit only by the faint moonlight from the street. Ilara stood over the scattered ledgers, her face pale but resolute, and in the center of the room, Cale was locked in a desperate life-or-death struggle with the town's most prominent citizen. For a long, terrible moment, everything hung in the balance. Brody's first instinct was to side with power, to subdue the escaped prisoner who was assaulting Mr. Croft. He raised his pistol, his aim centering on Cale. "Hold it right there, Cale, you are under arrest!" But before he could act, Ilara's voice, clear and strong and ringing with the irrefutable power of truth, cut through the chaos. "Sheriff, look!" she cried, pointing not at the fighting men, but at the open ledgers scattered on the floor. "It is all there. Ask him about the Henderson family. Ask him how he acquired the Miller Ranch after that fire last spring. Ask him about every struggling family in this town that owes him money. The proof is at your feet." Sheriff Brody hesitated, his gun still raised. He knew the Henderson family. He knew they were good people who had been struggling mightily. He knew the questions surrounding the Miller Ranch fire. He looked from the ledgers to the contorted, hate-filled face of Silas Croft, and then to Cale, who was not fighting with a killer's malice, but with the raw, desperate strength of a survivor protecting the woman he loved. In that single, clarifying instant, Brody saw the truth. He saw the rot that had been festering at the heart of his town, his pragmatism, which had so long served the interests of power, finally aligned with the cause of justice. "Silas Croft," he said, his voice flat and official as he lowered his gun and gestured to his deputy, "you are under arrest, not for the flimsy, fabricated charge of framing Cale, but for the mountain of documented, provable crimes scattered at his feet. It was a charge that would stick, a charge that would bring his entire empire of fear and control crashing down into dust." The story did not end with a perfect, fairy tale wedding. There was no celebration in the streets of Redemption Creek. Ilara and Cale were free, but they were not welcome. In toppling the town's king, they had exposed the town's own hypocrisy, its willingness to follow a tyrant and condemn an innocent man. There was no place for them in the wreckage of the world they had broken. The final scene took place at the first light of dawn. 2 horses stood ready, packed with what few possessions they had between them. Martha stood on the porch of the boarding house, her face grim but proud. She pressed a heavy canvas bag into Ilara's hands. It contained food, supplies, and her life savings, a final, fierce act of solidarity. "The world is hard on people like you," Martha said, her voice rough with emotion. "So you will have to be harder. Go now, and do not ever look back." They rode out of town, leaving the raw lumber buildings and the petty hatreds behind them without a single backward glance. They did not head east, back toward the civilized world that had already failed them both. They headed west, deeper into the vast, unforgiving country, toward the rugged, unknown mountains that shimmered on the horizon like a promise. Their future was a blank page. It would undoubtedly be filled with hardship, with struggle, with the daily business of survival in a land that offered no easy comfort. But as they rode side by side, the rising sun cast their long shadows across the sun-drenched sagebrush, merging them into one. They were 2 survivors, bound by a love that had been forged in tragedy and tempered in fire. And for the first time in their lives, they were truly, completely free, heading toward a future they would build for themselves. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.